Snow falls in darkness. The thermometer drops to 20 below. Inside a log cabin on the Dakota frontier, a cast iron stove glows red in the corner. A man feeds it one last log before bed. The metal radiates fierce heat, but only for a moment. By midnight, the stove will be cold. By dawn, the cabin could be frozen. Yet when morning comes, the family wakes in warmth. The room is still heated, not by the stove, but by something else. A massive bed of stone and brick built beneath and around the firebox, releasing stored energy through the night. This may seem like luck, but it isn't. It is engineering. But this raises the question: how did frontiersmen create heating systems that turned a few logs into 20 hours of warmth? For 200 years before the frontier opened, American colonists heated their homes with open fireplaces, massive stone structures built into the gable ends of wooden houses. The fireplace was the center of colonial life. It cooked food, dried clothes, provided light, and radiated heat to anyone willing to stand close enough to scorch their shins. But from the perspective of physics, the open hearth was a catastrophe. 90% of the heat generated by burning wood escaped straight up the chimney. The flames roared, the logs crackled, and almost all of that energy vanished into the night sky. What little warmth remained in the room came entirely from radiation, direct heat waves traveling in straight lines from the glowing coals to any surface in their path. This created a brutal asymmetry. A person standing 3 feet from the fire would feel intense, almost painful heat on their chest and face. Their back, meanwhile, remained near freezing. This was not a metaphor. It was measurable. The Stefan Boltzmann law governs radiant heat transfer. Energy decreases rapidly with distance, proportional to the 4th power of the temperature difference. Step 5 feet back, and the warmth drops by more than half. Move to the far corner of a room, and the temperature hovers just above freezing, even with a roaring fire consuming an armload of logs every hour. The fireplace also created a secondary problem. To sustain combustion, it required a constant supply of oxygen. That air had to come from somewhere, and it came from the room. Cold air poured in through every crack in the walls, rushed past the shivering occupants, fed the fire, and exited as hot smoke. The house became a wind tunnel. Settlers stuffed rags into gaps between logs. They hung blankets over doorways. They built cabins deliberately small, averaging 16 by 18 feet, to minimize the volume of air that needed to be heated. But unfortunately, none of it worked. The fireplace demanded fuel, and fuel demanded air, and air meant cold. In the winter of 1740 to 1741, one of the coldest seasons ever recorded in North America, the city of Philadelphia nearly ran out of firewood. Prices spiked. People tore down fences to burn in their hearths. And Benjamin Franklin, watching his neighbors suffer, began to think about the physics of fire. He called himself a smoke doctor. He believed that the indoor environment was a miniature version of Earth's atmosphere, and that it could be controlled, redirected, and optimized for human comfort. In 1742, Franklin designed the Pennsylvania fireplace, a freestanding cast iron structure intended to produce more heat and less smoke than an open hearth. The device resembled a small metal box with a firebox at the front and a hollow baffle at the rear. Cold air from the room entered the bottom of the baffle, passed upward through a narrow channel heated by flames and exhaust gases, and exited through holes at the top. This was convection, the movement of heated air, not just radiation. For the first time, a heating device was actively circulating warmth throughout the room. Franklin also introduced an inverted siphon. Instead of allowing hot gases to rise directly into the chimney, his design forced them to travel downward behind the baffle before ascending. This elongated the path of the smoke, giving the cast iron more time to absorb heat that would otherwise escape. The iron glowed, the room warmed, and Franklin believed he had solved the problem. But he soon realized that he hadn't. The Pennsylvania fireplace failed commercially. The flue was positioned at the bottom of the stove, and without a strong upward draft, the smoke would cool inside the device and blow back into the room. To keep the draft alive, the fire had to burn continuously, let it die, and the next lighting would fill the house with fumes. Settlers returned to their fireplaces. 40 years later, an astronomer and inventor named David Rittenhouse solved the draft problem with a single modification: an L-shaped stovepipe that sent smoke directly upward into the chimney. This simple addition created a reliable thermal gradient. Hot air rose naturally, pulling fresh air into the stove and pushing exhaust out. The Franklin stove, as it came to be called, finally worked. And by the early 1800s, as the frontier pushed westward into the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, the cast iron stove had become the most significant piece of domestic technology in America. The transformation was not gradual, it was industrial. Cast iron foundries exploded across the Northeast in the decades following 1800. Albany and Troy, New York, became world centers of stove production. Foundries like Hopewell Furnace in Pennsylvania manufactured over 100 different sizes and styles, from simple 6-plate boxes to ornate 10-plate models engraved with Rococo art. The manufacturing process used flask casting, wooden patterns pressed into damp sand to create molds, molten iron poured in, cooled plates removed and shipped flat in stacks. This flat-pack design was critical. A wagon crossing the plains could not carry a fully assembled masonry chimney or a 2-ton stone hearth. However, it could take 20 cast iron plates, each weighing 5 pounds, bundled and stacked like books. On arrival, the plates were bolted together with iron rods to form a radiating box. A stovepipe was attached. The stove was placed in the center of the cabin or near a wall, and for the first time, heat came from all 6 surfaces: front, back, left, right, top, and bottom. The efficiency gain was immediate. A 6-plate stove achieved a thermal efficiency of 25 to 35%, compared to the fireplace's 5 to 10%. That meant a family could heat the same space with 1/3 the wood. On the treeless plains, where settlers burned dried buffalo dung or twisted hay for fuel, this was the difference between survival and abandonment. But efficiency alone did not solve the problem of night. Cast iron heats rapidly. Its high thermal conductivity allows it to absorb energy from combustion and radiate it into the room within minutes. This makes it ideal for raising the temperature quickly after a fire is lit. However, what it also means is that the metal cools rapidly once the fire dies. A stove left unattended for 3 hours drops to ambient temperature, and by midnight, the cabin is as cold as the air outside. Frontiersmen needed a way to extend the heat. They needed storage. They soon came up with a solution: mass. Not metal mass, but stone, brick, and earth. Materials with low thermal conductivity, but high thermal capacity. These materials absorbed heat slowly, but once heated, they released it for hours. The principle is simple. Thermal capacity is the product of mass and specific heat. The amount of energy required to raise 1 kilogram of a material by 1 degree. Cast iron has a specific heat of 460 joules per kilogram per degree. Brick has a specific heat of 840. Sandstone is 900. Soapstone is 980. By placing these materials in direct contact with or near the stove, settlers created secondary radiators, thermal batteries that charged during the day and discharged through the night. Some built platforms. They stacked fieldstone or brick into a raised bed beneath the stove, so that the firebox sat directly on the masonry. As the stove burned, heat conducted downward into the stone. By evening, the platform was too hot to touch. The fire was allowed to die, and for the next 12 to 20 hours, the stone radiated warmth into the room, warming the floor, the air, and anyone sleeping on or near the platform. Others directed stove heat toward the back walls, A cabin built with a stone or brick chimney base could position the stove inches away, allowing radiant and conducted heat to soak into the masonry. The wall became a heat sink, glowing faintly in the darkness long after the stove went cold. Still others used the cabin itself. Log walls, though poor insulators by modern standards, have significant thermal mass. A softwood log 12 inches in diameter has a density of 500 kilograms per cubic meter and a specific heat of 1,200 joules per kilogram per degree. Over the course of a sunny winter day, the south-facing wall of a cabin absorbs solar radiation. The effect is subtle, perhaps 2 or 3 degrees, but in a well-chinked cabin, it compounds with the stove's residual heat to keep temperatures above freezing. For personal warmth, settlers used soapstone. This metamorphic rock, dense and smooth, was prized for its ability to hold heat longer than any other common material. A soapstone block weighing 10 pounds could be placed in the firebox for an hour, wrapped in rags, and carried to bed. It remained warm until morning. Women used smaller stones as foot warmers in wagons during winter travel. Brass bed warmers, long-handled pans filled with hot coals, were slid between layers of quilts to preheat the mattress before sleep. These were not folk remedies. They were applications of physics, learned through trial and error, passed between neighbors, and refined over decades. Not all heating knowledge came from trial. Some came from immigration. Settlers arriving from Northern Europe and Asia brought centuries-old masonry traditions that prioritized thermal mass over rapid heating. And on the Dakota frontier in the late 1800s, these traditions collided with American assumptions about efficiency. A Russian immigrant, historical records suggest a man named Pavle Volkov, though details remain incomplete, built a masonry heater in his homestead. The structure was enormous, a brick maze weighing over a ton, with internal channels that forced hot gases to snake through the mass before exiting the chimney. His American neighbors mocked it. They called it wasteful. They called it foreign foolishness. Why build a 2-ton stove when a 200-pound cast iron box could heat a room in 10 minutes? The first winter answered the question. Volkov's heater required 1 firing per day. He loaded it with wood in the morning, burned it hot for 2 hours, and let it smolder out. The brick absorbed 80% of the combustion energy. By evening, the surface of the heater was too hot to touch. By midnight, it was warm. By dawn, it was still radiating heat. His cabin stayed above 60 degrees for 20 hours. His neighbors, meanwhile, woke every 3 hours to refuel their cast iron stoves. If they slept through a cycle, the cabin dropped below freezing. Children cried. Water buckets iced over. And slowly, the Americans began to understand. The immigrant was not wasting brick, but was rather banking heat. However, this was not a new idea. The Russian pechka had existed for centuries in Siberia, where winter temperatures routinely dropped to 40 below zero. The Chinese kang, a raised masonry platform heated by kitchen stove exhaust, served the same function. Korean ondol systems ran heated air beneath the entire floor. All of these cultures had independently solved the same problem: how to survive the night without continuously burning fuel. The answer was always mass, but in America, the tradition did not take root widely. The cast iron stove was faster, cheaper, and more portable. It fit the American frontier ethos of mobility and individual resourcefulness. Masonry heaters required skilled labor, permanent settlement, and a supply of brick or stone. Most settlers were transient. They built temporary cabins, tested their claims, and moved on. The stove moved with them. The masonry stayed behind. It would take another century and an energy crisis in the 1970s before Americans rediscovered what the Russians had known all along. Modern masonry heaters, now marketed as Siberian stoves or Finnish fireplaces, achieve efficiencies of 70 to 80%. They are once again being built in Montana, Vermont, and Alaska. The knowledge never disappeared, it was simply ignored. The adoption of the stove changed more than temperature. It changed architecture. For 2 centuries, the fireplace had dictated the layout of the American home. Because the chimney was a massive, fixed structure built of stone or brick, it had to be positioned at the gable end of the house. The entire building was oriented around it. Rooms radiated outward from the hearth. The chimney was the spine. The stove broke that constraint. A stovepipe weighs 10 pounds and flexes with the structure. It can exit through a wall, a roof, or a second-story floor. This flexibility allowed settlers to place the stove anywhere, in the center of the room for maximum radiant coverage, near a corner to conserve floor space, or against an interior wall to heat multiple rooms with a single firebox. It also allowed for specialization. Early log cabins were hall houses, where all activities occurred, including cooking, eating, sleeping, and working. With the stove, the kitchen could be separated. A second stove could heat a bedroom. The stovepipe could run through an upper loft, capturing waste heat to warm sleeping areas that had previously been unheated. Families began to build additions. The single-room cabin evolved into the multi-room homestead. Even the chimney itself changed. The mud and stick chimneys of early frontier cabins, called cat chimneys, were temporary structures built of wood daubed with clay. They caught fire regularly and were designed to be pulled away from the house when they ignited. With the stove, the chimney became unnecessary. The pipe could be routed directly through the roof with a metal collar, eliminating the fire hazard entirely. But the most significant architectural change was insulation, or rather, the awareness of it. Fireplaces required so much air exchange that airtightness was irrelevant. As long as the chimney drew, the fire burned. But stoves required control. Too much air, and the fire consumed fuel too quickly. Too little, and it smoldered, producing smoke and creosote. Settlers learned to chink and daub their cabins not just to block wind, but to create a stable thermal envelope. Chinking was the material, usually wood strips or stones, used to fill the gaps between horizontal logs. Daubing was the sealant, a mixture of clay, mud, lime, and animal hair, applied over the chinking to prevent air infiltration. Research into frontier construction reveals that the primary value of daubing was not its insulating R value, which was negligible, but its ability to stop air movement. A cabin with tight chinking and good daubing could reduce air exchange by half, making the stove's heat last twice as long. This was learned behavior. The first generation of settlers often built cabins with round, unhewn logs and minimal chinking. They suffered. The second generation hewed their logs flat on 2 sides, creating tight joints. They plastered the chinking inside and out. They insulated their roofs with sod or bark, and they survived. The stove also transformed domestic labor, particularly for women. Cooking over an open hearth required constant physical exertion. A woman bent over a fire for hours, suspended pots from iron cranes, raked coals forward to create cooking zones, and tended multiple vessels simultaneously. The heat was intense, the smoke was choking, and the tools were heavy. A cast-iron Dutch oven with legs, designed to sit directly in coals, could weigh 20 pounds empty. The cook stove changed this. It provided a flat surface at waist height with multiple burners. Pots no longer needed to be suspended. Heat could be controlled by adjusting the firebox damper or moving pots to cooler zones. The work was still exhausting, but it was no longer punishing. However, the stove required a complete relearning of culinary skills. There were no temperature dials. A cook judged heat by holding her hand above the surface, counting seconds before the pain became unbearable. She learned to read the color of the firebox: red for high heat, orange for medium, dull for low. She knew which pots conducted heat fastest and which retained it longest. and she adapted her recipes. Traditional tools, like the spider-leg Dutch oven, were useless on a flat stovetop. New tools, new techniques, and new knowledge replaced the old. Some women resented this. The open hearth had been their domain for generations, and the stove felt like an intrusion. A machine imposed by men who did not understand the craft of cooking. Others welcomed it. The reduction in physical strain allowed for more complex meals, more frequent baking, and more time spent on other tasks. The response was not uniform. It was personal. But the stove did more than change labor. It changed the meaning of the home. The open hearth had been a social hub, a place where families gathered, stories were told, and community was forged. The fire was alive. It crackled and danced. It demanded attention. The stove, by contrast, was silent. It radiated heat, but it did not glow with the same life. Some families mourned this loss. They felt the home had become colder, not in temperature, but in spirit. By the end of the 19th century, as coal stoves became standard and centralized heating systems began to appear in wealthier homes, a wave of nostalgia swept through American culture. Museums and exhibitions began to feature colonial kitchens, reconstructed hearths with hanging pots and open fires, presented as symbols of early American virtue. The very system that earlier generations had fought to escape was now romanticized as authentic, wholesome, and pure. The stove, once a symbol of progress, was seen as a necessary evil. This pattern would repeat. Every technological shift in domestic heating, from stove to furnace, from coal to oil, from manual to automatic, would produce both relief and regret. Comfort and nostalgia are inseparable. The final transformation was economic. The shift from wood to coal was not driven by preference. It was driven by scarcity. By the 1820s, the forests surrounding major cities had been depleted. Firewood prices doubled, then tripled. In rural areas, wood remained abundant, but in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, it became a luxury. The organic economy of the forest could not sustain the energy demands of a growing industrial nation. Anthracite coal, discovered in Pennsylvania, offered a solution. It burned hotter than wood, produced less smoke, and contained more energy per pound. A single ton of anthracite could replace 3 cords of wood. And unlike wood, which had to be harvested, dried, and transported in bulk, coal could be mined year-round and shipped by canal and railroad. But coal required a different stove. The 10-plate stove, with its internal grate and ash pit, was designed specifically for anthracite. The grate allowed air to flow beneath the coal bed, sustaining combustion. The ash pit collected waste without smothering the fire. These stoves became the standard in cities by the 1850s. The transition from wood to coal also marked a shift from an organic economy to a mineral economy, from renewable resources managed by farmers to finite resources extracted by industry. This shift would define the next century. The cast iron stove, once a tool of frontier survival, became a tool of industrial dependence. And the knowledge of how to heat with wood, stone, and mass, knowledge that had been refined over millennia, began to fade. The heating systems of the 19th century American frontier were not perfect. They were smoky, inefficient by modern standards, and labor-intensive. But they worked. They allowed families to survive winters that would have killed them a generation earlier. They turned a few logs and a pile of rocks into a night of warmth. And they demonstrated a fundamental truth about human survival. Comfort is not a gift of nature. It is a product of knowledge, effort, and ingenuity. The cast iron stove, combined with thermal mass, represented a convergence of metallurgy, physics, and immigrant wisdom. It was not a single invention, but a system, an integration of rapid heating and slow release, of industrial production and traditional craft. of American mobility and Siberian permanence. And though modern heating systems have rendered the stove obsolete, the Frontier principles remain. Thermal mass is still used in passive solar homes. Masonry heaters are still built in cold climates, and the knowledge that heat can be stored, not just generated, continues to shape how we build. The frontier is gone, the cabins are empty, but the lesson endures. Survival is not about having more fuel. It is about using it wisely.